The school to prison pipeline. You might have heard of it if you've been in the education system for longer than maybe 1 or 2 years, or if you're an educator. So, what exactly is it? And how does it affect you, your teaching, or how the school system is running in general? In order to understand the pipeline, we have to go back and look at the history of our education system. So, back in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education was passed, and this called for the desegregation of schools. Principals and teachers didn't exactly want to go through with this change, though, and so throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, we see widespread pushback against this ruling. This comes in the form of legislation. So throughout the 1960s, we see different legal loopholes being exploited. Specifically, we see different laws being enacted in different states to prevent juvenile delinquency, or pretty much just any sort of backlash, retaliation against the more harsh treatment of African American students. So that goes with things like walkouts or protests. And these laws criminalized any sort of protesting in general. And this spread further into even just regular everyday kid behavior in classrooms, talking during class, being late to class, things like that were seen as major infractions and ended up resulting in expulsion and suspension at a much higher rate among Black students than white students. In fact, in the 1972 to 1973 school year, 15 states reported suspending over 30,000 students during the year. And over 50% of all the students who were suspended were Black, even though less than 40% of the students in the district were Black or Latinx. So as you can see, these harsher punishments and rules was chiefly used as a tactic to keep African American students out of schools. But this wasn't enough for white parents. Throughout the 1970s, we saw massive pushback by parents in the form of protests and widespread show up to school board meetings where parents protested saying that treatment of African American students wasn't harsh enough and that principals weren't taking the safety of their students seriously. These protests by parents resulted in Get Tough policies being created by principals and legislators across the state. These policies were essentially any minor infraction would result in a suspension, and then if you got enough suspensions, which is typically 3 or so, you would get expelled from the school or even be sent to alternative schools. And this also led to the creation of school police forces. So these Get Tough policies, and mixed with the legislation, created a grounds for school police forces. School police forces is eventually how we get student resource officers or SROs in schools. But this was sort of the early version of that. So these Get Tough policies led to more police involvement in schools, which led to more students being involved in the incarceration system much earlier than they would have been typically. And these Get Tough policies eventually led to the creation of zero tolerance policies, which is basically just the same thing under a different name. In 1971, busing started, which is essentially where they took both white and African American students and shipped them to different districts to go to different schools in order to forcibly mingle the schools and hopefully end desegregation, which it wasn't exactly perfect, but it did help to a certain extent. So how does this affect today? We know that this happened in the past, but busing seems to have ended desegregation, and the redrawing of district lines furthered that. But that's not exactly true. At-risk students are characterized as students who have a higher risk of dropping out, failing a class, or having to repeat a grade. These at-risk students often have different lived experiences than the teachers that are teaching them. If these teachers aren't properly educated about at-risk students, they could mistake different behaviors of theirs to be disciplinary infractions and refer them to the office. A quote from Honey Morgan on his paper about the pipeline explains to us that children from low-income households often suffer from poor nutrition and experience learning problem as a result of lack of food. Untrained educators may believe low-income students of color are lazy and show little effort, although the reason they may appear lethargic involves lack of food. So from this, you can sort of see how teachers' misunderstandings can lead students to be referred to the disciplinary office more often than their counterparts. More referrals to the office means more chance at suspension and a higher chance at being pulled out of the classroom. When you're pulled out of the classroom, you lose access to essential instruction in the classroom. Remember those zero tolerance policies that we talked about earlier? Those are sort of the main disciplinary system in the United States. The system essentially is you have a disciplinary infraction. The teacher refers the student to the disciplinary office. That could be a warning or it could be a suspension. If the student is suspended 3 times, then that student can be expelled from the school. Being suspended from school and taken out of this instruction causes these students to fall behind in class. Falling behind in class can lead to more frustration and the belief that these students just can't do it. They're just not smart enough. And that leads to a big demotivation of these students. Being removed from this instruction and suspensions, leading to lower grades, causing this acting out, can lead to even lower grades, acting out more, which means more suspensions, and it can kind of run in this sort of cyclical spiral until eventually the student is expelled, they fail a grade, or they drop out. In another quote from Hani Morgan, we can see that students with records of suspension or expulsions were twice as likely to repeat a grade than those not suspended or expelled for discretionary violation. So we can recognize the pipeline as moving from the history of white principals and legislators not wanting African American students in their schools and finding a way to essentially remove them from schools by expelling them or suspending them. And then moving into today, after busing and redrawing of district lines, schools are desegregated, but there is still this high rate of at-risk students and minority students and low-income students failing grades, not completing schools, and being referred to alternative schools. But you might be wondering, where exactly does the prison part of this come into play? Well, you know how we talked about higher police presence in schools earlier? This higher police presence in schools doesn't exactly keep children as safe as you'd think it would. Having student resource officers in schools oftentimes leads to children being involved in the incarceration system a lot earlier than they typically would be, meaning that they already have a permanent record or some sort of record. Even if it's a juvenile record, they're still being involved with police at an earlier age, which leads them to have this sort of mentality that they are destined for the incarceration system. This is the school to prison pipeline. Poor academic handling of students, leading to students believing that they are destined only for the incarceration system, not believing they can reach their dreams, not believing that they can do something with their life outside of the prison system, outside of where they grew up. But throughout the rest of the 1950s and into the 1960s, we see that principals and legislators weren't exactly too hyped. That's the most cringe thing ever. Inspire fear in the children. Also incarceration. I didn't say that, but it's also incarceration.